Hello and welcome to The Queer Gaze, where we dissect queer media from every country, complete with nuanced discussion of representation and issues.
This season, we've organized our titles by theme, and we're going to be comparing popular, well-known films with lesser-known titles.
You can support The Queer Gaze and get access to extra content at patreon.com/thequeergaze.
And you can follow us on social media at The Queer Gaze.
Hello, Joe. How are you doing?
Doing okay. I'm excited to start this back up with you again.
Yeah, it's fun, and to take it in an audio version this time.
A medium that's a little bit more comfortable for both of us, perhaps.
Yes, probably. Well, what's our theme?
Yeah, so for our more popular title, to kick it off, we thought, what is a big queer film that's going to get people talking? And we decided we would go with Ang Lee's Brokeback Mountain. So we're going to be talking about internalized homophobia, but with a little specific caveat: in rural atmospheres. So we're talking about, in this case, it's Wyoming?
Yes, Wyoming of the 1960s as well, though apparently this story takes place over the course of 20 years, which you wouldn't tell necessarily from looking at the baby faces of our stars.
Oh my god, yeah. So folks, in case you have not heard of this incredibly popular queer title, this is Ang Lee's 2005 film, so it will be celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, and it stars Jake Gyllenhaal as Jack Twist. He is one of our two love interests, and then we also have the late great Heath Ledger playing Ennis Del Mar, and they fall in love and yes, have a tumultuous 20-something year relationship as sheep farmers. Ennis gets married to Alma, who is played by Michelle Williams, and then Jack gets married to Lorene, who is Anne Hathaway. And yeah, you're right, Conrad, these all look like absolute babyface children.
Yes, they do. Although later in the film, they do get some quote-unquote old age makeup, which appears to look like they've taken that sort of white PVC glue that you had as kids in school and just sort of stuck it under their eyes until it got all sort of flaky. Yeah. At high definitions, it doesn't do terribly well, the old age makeup, I'm afraid.
No. I remember being more convinced of this in 2005 when I actually saw it, but I'm curious, Conrad, did you see this movie when it was initially released?
I did, yes. I didn't see it in theaters. I saw it on DVD, probably. That would have been a Blockbuster rental, I would have thought, back in the days. And it was around about the time of all of the Oscar buzz.
Right.
But I have to say, I wasn't particularly holding out high hopes for it because I was more interested in independent films around that time for queer representation. So the sort of thing that were being released on DVD by Peccadillo Pictures, a label in the UK. And I tended to feel as though anything that reached the Oscars and was in the mainstream was going to be like Philadelphia and be terribly worthy, but pretty
safe. Yeah.
And I have to say, that was my initial impression of it back in those days. I haven't watched it since.
Right.
I just thought this is just a picturesque, shallow misery porn movie.
Oh, okay.
That goes the easy route and has the tragic, doomed gay love affair where somebody dies at the end and everybody cries a lot.
Yeah. I mean, that is accurate, right? Like, that is what we're getting. It feels in some ways like a holdover from a lot of popular texts from the 90s. So not just things like Philadelphia, but yeah, a lot of the sort of mainstream depictions. I think we joked about this when we were doing our coming out reaction series, right? So often it was, well, if you come out and have sex, then you're probably going to get hooked on drugs or you're going to get AIDS and you will die.
Yes. And if you fall in love in a really romantic way, then your partner definitely will get lynched at some point.
Yeah.
But I have to say, on rewatching it for this podcast, and also because I recently had the pleasure of seeing the West End stage production.
Right.
So I was reacquainted with the story through a different medium. I actually found it more touching. So I think I was possibly a little immature when I watched it 20 years ago.
Yeah, I had a similar reaction. So I saw this in theaters because I think this was back in the time when I was actively trying to watch all of the Oscar nominated films. I would go to parties and have the list and try to make my predictions and so on.
Yeah.
And I remember liking it, but even back then, as like a fresh out of the closet baby, I still was frustrated that we had cast two straight actors to play very prominent gay roles. And I'll confess that that hasn't entirely changed. Rewatching this, I am much more generous to the two performances. And, I don't want to say, oh, they're so brave for taking on these roles when they are not queer identifying actors. But I do think that we were definitely still in a time period where it wasn't like this could be a career killer. And the
Mm.
fact that for a long time, this movie was not referred to as Brokeback Mountain in the popular consciousness or even in the mainstream media. It was the gay cowboy movie.
Yes, the gay cowboy movie that was offered to Matt Damon, who turned it
Hmm.
down because he'd just been the talented Mr. Ripley and in a cowboy movie.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it is interesting to think that Gus Van Sant was offered this as well as Pedro Almodovar, and they either couldn't get it off the ground, like Gus Van Sant couldn't find a way to sort of make it work, and then Almodovar said no because they wouldn't give him final cut.
Right. Okay. Well, I can understand that. Although you can't imagine it now being anybody other than Ang Lee directing this. There is something intrinsically so important about the landscape
Yes.
and its relationship to the two men's burgeoning love affair, and also
Hmm.
giving you a really strong sense of the time and place and the environment that they're living in. It's something that Ang Lee seems to be so good at doing, whether he's doing drawing rooms in Sense and Sensibility or whether he's doing the Midwest in Brokeback Mountain.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't seen a ton of Ang Lee films, but even just judging this film by itself, there's this austere quality to it, right? Where you could say, oh, it's just a very pretty movie about sad cowboys and one of them dies. But I think that belittles the film's ultimate message, which is very melancholy. But I think it's also a bit of a celebration of, maybe this is being too generous, but in some ways it's a bit of a celebration of how far we have come, where you look at, and this is maybe where we move into your Conrad, Queer, and Terry, but especially when we're thinking about internalized homophobia, like the movie is basically about two men who can't live an authentic life and how it destroys not just their own lives, but the lives of their wives and their children. And it's like, this is why people need to be able to love the people that they love and do the things that they need to do, because otherwise it just has this cascading sadness that ends up just torpedoing a lot of people's happiness.
Yes, and it was quite interesting for me. I've been reading the book Farm Boys by Will Fellows, which was given to both actors as source material for them.
Oh, okay.
And it's a collection of oral histories, first person histories from gay men growing up in the Midwest,
Oh, wow.
coming of age in the mid 60s through to the mid 80s. And it's fascinating. But yeah, it talks about how the farming communities and the families of their boyhoods would be characterized by these rigid gender roles, ethnic
Hmm.
homogeneity, social isolation, racism, religious conservatism, sexual prudishness, which came as a surprise to me because you would think that the role of looking after, animal husbandry, you would have a fairly prosaic and practical approach towards the realities of life and death, but
Right.
not so much so. In fact, quite the reverse. And yeah, just a suspicion of the unfamiliar and limited access to information.
Right.
And it's interesting, sort of contrasting the image that we get of the American West from the Midwest of Ang Lee's movie versus all of the movies that we saw before that with John Wayne and that were all shot in Monument Valley. I mean, it's just in terms of the color tones and the way that the life is depicted, it's very,
Yeah.
very different.
Yeah, there's to me an inherent sadness to the film. And I think obviously it's baked into the sort of tragedy of the love story. Like, we're watching these men who just can't be honest with themselves, who can't be honest with their lover, who can't be honest with their wives, and how that really ultimately hurts them. But it's even just really embodied in this landscape, right? Like, it's tough living, and we keep hearing how Ennis is broke, and it's really hard for him, and how that ends up spiraling into things like potential alcoholism. Like, there's no domestic abuse here, but there's definitely emotional abuse in the way that they both treat their wives and how they're distant fathers, and they just never can prioritize happiness. And it feels like it really comes out in the desolate spaces. Like, the happiest times are when we see them camping, and it's just them being able to sort of go back to the land.
Yeah. And open up to each other. And that's the thing that I think is the most affecting, actually, and the reason why I think both the men should have gotten the Oscar nods that they deserved
Hmm.
beyond nominations, because we can get onto that. Neither of them won.
Right.
But I particularly like their depiction of Ennis and Jack. Just Ennis, who is very, very quiet, very taciturn man, barely says
Yes.
a word, so suddenly unspooling all of this information about his history
Hmm.
and admitting that it's more words than he said in a year. And just their growing ease with each other physically as well.
Hmm.
Something that I think that I'm interested in coming back to is the depiction of relationships, physical relationships in these movies is
Yes.
particularly interesting in relation to the masculinity and the internalized homophobia. Jack and Ennis's initial sexual experience together is one that is teetering on the edge of violence,
Hmm.
and their second time together is much more
Yeah.
gentle and
Yes.
affectionate and intimate, physically intimate. And then you see them sort of horse playing and running around and slapping each other and chasing each other and stuff. But it's still teetering on the edge of violence. Quite
Yeah.
often, their roughhousing results in them punching each other. And that is something that I thought the two of them depicted incredibly well. It's a very nuanced pair of performances, but particularly Heath, of course, is the standout here.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because so often we're prone to praising the louder, more ostentatious performance, right? Which would be Gyllenhaal, because Jack is far more prone to emotional outbursts. He's wearing his heart on his sleeve. He does talk more. So he gets these moments of outrage. Even if you watch in the early parts of the film, it's Jack who's kind of scoping out the scene. Like, you can see Gyllenhaal looking over at different instances to sort of see, like, am I meeting his eye? Are we sort of doing the undercurrent of, is he interested in me? And Ledger's performance is so much more restrained. Half the time it feels like he's speaking over a curled lip, like he's mumbling so much of his dialogue. And it's very quiet, but there's this intensity behind it that is really palpable. You know, it's one of those things where I think this is why people were so devastated after his death, because we got this and then we got The Dark Knight, and you thought, oh my God, the range. And I didn't really think he had it in him based on some early performances, which were in, you know, genre fare, some YA stuff, typically derided places. And then he's just gone. But I think it's interesting because I always liked Ledger's performance, like even back in 2005 when I first saw the film. And I thought that Gyllenhaal was wrong for the part.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, it just, he read too young. It didn't feel like he had the emotional register to meet Ledger. So it felt like they were unevenly balanced. And coming back to this with 20 years hindsight, I actually think it's a much more carefully calibrated performance than I was giving it credit for. Like, I do think Gyllenhaal's expressiveness is integral to Jack as a character, but I do actually like him more as the film goes on, because I think he gets to go on a bit more of an arc when he gets so angry at Ennis for the life they could have led.
Yeah, I agree. And it was only when I really paid attention that I realized that when he is killed, you see him being lynched by three people while Anne Hathaway calmly describes some fake accident that he's supposed to have had.
Hmm.
She mentions that he died at the age of 39, which, if you spool that back, means that when we first meet Jack, he's 19.
Right.
So Jake works for 19, I think, at
Yes.
the beginning of the movie. And I do believe him as a jaded 39-year-old who's just angry, but still holding on to hope. One thing that I noted this time around is when Ennis goes to Jack's family, goes to visit his parents after he has passed.
Devastating.
Yeah, it is quite upsetting, that part of the movie. But his father, probably just to hurt him, mentions that there was another man that he thought he was going
Yes.
to bring up to the farm and shack up with to take over the ranch. And I
Mm-hmm.
was wondering to myself, is that Randall? Is that the David Harbour character?
I think it's what we're meant to believe. Yes.
Yeah. So he was maintaining hope of building that life with someone,
Yeah.
anyone.
Yes, but I do
Then,
think his preference would have been Ennis, but when
yeah.
he tried to raise it again, and Ennis still hadn't changed, even after the divorce, when it seemed like, okay, you're not being tied down to this anymore. Like, you could move to Texas with me. You could do this. And Ennis rebuffs him again and says, it's not easy for me to just leave jobs anymore. I'm tired of being broke. And I'm like, okay, as a jaded middle-aged person, I definitely understand that. But also, it starts to sound like an excuse. I'd rather be unhappy, but fit into the world that I was brought up in, that I am socially expected to participate in. I can't ranch with a man and be the urban legend that some father brings his young son to after they get killed. And that flashback is also fucking devastating.
Yes, it is, particularly because I misremembered it. I didn't think they showed you what the father showed Ennis as a 9-year-old boy.
I didn't think so either.
So I was really shocked. I thought, have I got the uncut version? This is
No.
horrifying.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess it was always in there and I just blanked it out.
It was. I do want to circle back, though, to that conversation that Ennis has with Lorene, because I don't read it that way. And I think that this is a subject of controversy. You can read it whichever way you so choose. But I read it as Lorene is telling the truth, and what Ennis is hearing is his worst fears that
Right.
Jack has been killed in a homophobic attack, because that's the end he always assumed would happen to anyone who actually lives their authentic life or is discovered in the process with another man.
That's true. Now, I take that point and I am aware of that discourse, but the
Mm-hmm.
thing that always got me was the building tension between Jack and Lorene's father,
Right.
who seems pretty quick, well, from the get-go, to not respect him because of his occupation. He calls him Rodeo
Rodeo.
rather than referring to him by his name.
Yep.
There seems to be a whole masculine battle over who gets to carve the Thanksgiving turkey. And
Mm-hmm.
this is both families. This seems to be a point of contention.
Yep.
I noticed that when Alma remarries, she gets the grocery store manager who has an electric carving knife, which emasculates him
Ooh.
even more.
He's not a real man. He can't even do it himself.
He can't, no, but Ennis isn't allowed to do it, so he's, yeah, definitely in the back seat. Yeah, so I take note of his father being the sense I got, a man of means and also a man who's
Mm-hmm.
connected, and a man who, if he so wished to arrange for 3 men to beat his wayward son-in-law to death,
Right.
he would probably do it. So my assumption is I was just connecting the dots and thinking that was what happened.
I could definitely see it. One of the interesting things that I did not pick up on in 2005 is that it does seem like every man has a read on them at a certain point, right? Like, there's a very telling moment where a young Jack goes up to the rodeo clan in the bar and says, "Hey, let me buy you a drink." And the guy says, "No, I'm just doing my job." And there's this moment of tension where you can tell Jack is trying to suss him out. Like, "Hey, are you actually interested in me sexually? Would you want to do this?" And the guy doesn't say anything, but he does then clearly walk away so he can join a group of other men. And there's this moment where I thought, is this going to turn into an act of violence? Like, is he going to say, "Hey, that F slur just tried to buy me a drink. We should beat the shit out of him as a result," or something like that? Like, there's these really awful moments of tension throughout the film where I'm less concerned when Alma sees them kissing on their reunion, because I know for her it's just emotionally devastating.
Yeah.
Whereas every time a man looks at them, you're waiting to see if violence is going to follow.
Yeah. Well, Annie Prue, the writer of the short story on which this is based. I think I'm pronouncing her surname correctly.
I think so,
She
yeah.
was inspired, she said, by two things that she observed in 1997. One was an older ranch hand in a bar watching the young cowboys playing pool. And she doesn't know, but she sort of, how you do that thing where you people watch and imagine a life for them. It
Right.
might have been that he was just interested in the game, but she also wondered if he was
Interest in the men?
interested in the men and kind of lonely. And
Right.
the character of Ennis started to pop into her head. But also another experience where she was in another bar cafe soon afterwards. And she listened to the rant of the owner complaining about two gay men who were in the night before and ordered a meal. And if there had been more regulars in, he said things would have gone differently for them.
Oh, wow.
So that got the cogs turning in her head. And then the short story emerged, which was picked up by one of the eventual screenwriters, Diana Asana, who
Ah,
collaborated with Larry McMurtry, the famous author of Lonesome Dove, to create the screenplay
yeah.
in 1998. Yeah, Annie Proulx didn't even think it would make a good movie. She didn't think there was enough material, and it only makes up about 50 pages of the script, but the result is undeniably powerful. And
Right.
it won Best Adapted Screenplay, at least,
Hmm.
because this film did not do well at the Oscars.
No, and maybe let's close out this main feed discussion with that. So, this historically and controversially lost to the movie Crash, not the masterpiece by David Cronenberg, but rather the Racism is Bad movie. It's an ensemble with Don Cheadle, Sandra Bullock. It's I don't know. I've never revisited. Of course, as I said, I was big into the Oscars, so I watched them both. I remember finding it emotionally affecting, but also in hindsight, like even when the Oscar was announced, I was embarrassed because I felt like one of these movies is going to stand the test of time, and one of these is an Oscar bait film. And lo and behold, I have never heard someone talk about Crash, like the 2005 Crash, in any kind of positive light, except to say, oh, yeah, that's the movie that basically stole Brokeback Mountain's
Yeah,
Oscars.
it was pretty much that across the board. And it's now appearing at the top of many worst Oscar Best Picture winners. It
Right.
often tops the list as one of the greatest injustices.
Yeah.
So Heath was beaten by Philip Seymour Hoffman in Capote.
Okay, beaten for another queer role.
Yeah, and Philip Seymour Hoffman was a genius. So
Hmm.
Jake was beaten by George Clooney in Syriana.
Not my favorite performance, but people seem to quite like that one.
Yeah, and Rachel Weisz in The Constant Gardener beat Michelle
That
Williams.
is a pretty good role.
Is it?
The Constant Gardener is a good one. Yeah.
I haven't seen it. Yeah, so bit of a failure for Brokeback Mountain at the Oscars, but it's remembered fondly.
Well, I'm curious though, do you think that, because I think it's easy for us to say, oh, well, this was homophobia or this was discomfort from a primarily older male voting membership for the Oscars. Like, do you think that was a significant contributing factor? Or do you think it was just like, meh, it's the way the cookie crumbles? Like, I think a lot of the times we do give too much stock to the Oscars as though it isn't a bunch of like secret handshakes and whining and dining and that kind of stuff.
Well, Annie Proulx thinks it was Scientologists.
Oh, okay.
She's on the record. No, I do think it probably was a safe choice, and we've seen that happen a number of times when there have
Hmm.
been one or two obvious contenders that really should win, and then the safe choice gets it, and you watch it, and it's something really, really bland, like that recent one that was basically just driving Miss Daisy for queers. What
Right.
was that called? Green Book?
Yeah.
Utterly forgettable movie.
Yes, it was.
Yeah, we've seen it happen many times before, and I do think it played a part in this. I think they didn't want to go for this and thought that maybe, particularly in the era that it was happening in, following the race riots, that perhaps
Hmm.
acknowledging this issue was the safer bet than gay
Right.
cowboy issue.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the things, the sort of silver lining of all of this is that the money did talk because this movie did quite well. If memory serves correct, it made over $100 million. So, like, that's not nothing, especially for a film where, yeah, people just derided it and gave it the, the gay cowboy movie moniker as though it had no artistic merit. And the fact that I don't see people talking about this a lot. I'll be curious to see what happens come December when it celebrates its anniversary. But I do think for a lot of folks, it was like, I watched this, it destroyed me emotionally. Like, all you had to do is say, like, the shirt or I wish I could quit you, and you've got people. Like, they remember the line, they remember the movie, whether or not they've watched it recently. I think it has definitely stood the test of time.
I think it has, yeah. And actually, it wasn't those two moments for me. It was Ennis in the alleyway after he has to say goodbye to Jack for the very first
Oh,
time.
yeah.
Yeah. Where he doesn't even know what he's feeling, but he
Hmm.
knows that it's so powerful that it's having a physical impact on him. And that was Heath Ledger. I think he really was a treasure. So it's a shame we couldn't have seen more performances from him. And I think retroactively watching this movie it becomes all the more touching because of that.
I agree. I agree. Okay, so folks, that's going to be it on the main feed. If you want to hear a little bit more of our conversation about the film, as well as, of course, our coveted categories and awards, do hop on over to Patreon. So it's patreon.com/thequeergaze. And we've got a couple of extra things that we're going to talk about over there.
Yes. Bye for now.